This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and the Great Courses Plus. Look, this episode is definitely getting demonetized. Possibly even age-restricted if my 12 Strong and 6 Days episodes are any indicator. So the history community on YouTube needs all the support we can get, and the Great Courses Plus was willing to sponsor this potentially suppressed episode. Because, well, they value historical education unlike YouTube itself. And of course they do. They're a subscription service built off of a 1990 venture that records and professionally produces, well, it's in the name, college courses. Essentially, they take university-level lectures given by prestigious professors in their field, apply some slick visuals, and generally make the lecture more compelling than being in the actual classroom, along with giving you access to supplemental course materials. And they cover all kinds of topics, not just history, from philosophical and scientific stuff to more practical and fun things like beer appreciation or photography. They've got an ever-growing list of thousands of lectures you can watch, and you can do so not only from your computer, but through their Android and Apple apps as well. Unlike an actual class, you can do this from the leisure of your own home without an instructor like me making sure that you've learned by testing you or whatnot. There's no tests. It's kind of like auditing a course, but with better production value. So if you click on the link in the description, or go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/thecynicalhistorian, you can get a free trial today. As a perfect companion for this episode, you can check out Salim Yaqub's The US and the Middle East from 1914 to 9/11. It's a good way to broaden your understanding of how the US got so heavily involved in the Middle East and its periphery like Afghanistan, which led to 9/11 and started the war I'm talking about in this episode. So go check them out, and on with the show. Hey, Cypher here. The Outpost is incredibly awkward for me to review. I liked it a lot, but I've also got some serious bias on this one, because I was only 40 miles away from where it happened, and had some indirect involvement. So I'm going to split the reality section in two, one about the overall historical situation, and the other about how I'm situated in it. Pay attention to the footnotes, since this will be jargon heavy, and I'm not going to bother explaining every acronym verbally. The Battle of Kamdesh, which is the focal point of the movie, was part of a buildup of conflict in Afghanistan resultant from a surge in troops that began in early 2009. Now, I'm going to be doing an episode on the causes of the global war on terror, so let's focus on why 2009 was such a pivotal year in the Afghanistan war. During the Afghanistan war, the heaviest fighting has been in the provinces bordering Pakistan. Pashtuns populate either side of that border and regularly cross it. Pakistan may also be giving aid to Taliban forces, or at least safe harbor. Much of the war is about trying to convince members of the tribe to side with the new government, which American intervention after 9/11 replaced the Taliban with. Loyalties sway easily. One day an Afghan might work for the police, the next, they may fight alongside a Taliban raid on a US Army post. To convince them of remaining loyal to the new regime, the US created provincial reconstruction teams in 2003. PRTs pay for construction projects throughout the country, building up infrastructure that's been severely neglected over the last 4 decades of warfare. This didn't replace patrolling and building up local military effectiveness, but PRTs shifted the focus of the war to nation building. Presence patrols make up the majority of operations outside the wire, but the majority of US funds goes toward construction projects throughout the country. After the 2007 troop surge in Iraq, violence declined in that country after a year of the surge. Then Senator Obama was initially openly critical of President Bush's strategy, but as it proved its worth, he'd end up implementing it within his first month as president. The decline in violence in one war saw the increase in violence in another. Afghan insurgents killed more than 133 Americans in 2008, the first year in that entire war to have more than 100 KIAs. This increase may not be connected. After all, correlation is not causation, but things were definitely getting worse in Afghanistan right after the troop surge in Iraq. By the beginning of 2009, there were over 50,000 troops overall, but only 20,000 Americans. On February 17, 2009, the newly inaugurated President Obama signed an order to begin increasing troops in Afghanistan. The biggest increase came a year later, especially after the Iraq War ended, but this was the beginning of it. Obama also replaced the former commander of the war with Stanley McChrystal, though Obama would come to regret that decision later. The surge initially increased violence, just as it had in Iraq a couple years prior. But the hope was that violence would eventually go down, and it has. There's been a steady withdrawal of troops since 2011, with the exception of a minor surge during the last couple years. The fight at COP Keating is part of this larger story, but it's also uniquely local. The COP was set up to waylay traffic on a tiny road alongside two rivers in Nuristan province near Kamdesh village. The placement was terrible tactically, and soldiers wanted to close it down immediately, especially after it gained its namesake when Lieutenant Keating fell to his death in 2006 because of trying to navigate the terrible road. They made an observation post up one mountain to hopefully prevent some sniper fire, but it never succeeded. Fob Bostic in Kunar province, near Nare, was the closest major US military post, with Cop Lowell on the road in between them. In 2008, the captain of the garrison there was assassinated by an IED, and later mobilizations to COP Keating never got a sufficient replacement. As the war heated up, so did Nuristan and Kunar. Fighting throughout the region kept COP Keating from closing. In May of 2009, OP Bariali in Kunar was overrun by Taliban fighters. A month later, a mere 20 days after McChrystal took command, a soldier in Paktika province deserted his post and was captured by the Taliban. 2 months later came the Afghan elections, with the Taliban attacking polling locations throughout the provinces along the Durand Line. Then, just a month before Kamdesh, the Battle of Ganjagal showed that even the most seemingly pleasant of valleys could turn deadly in the region. There was constant fighting between these named events too, so Keating remained open. McChrystal simply neglected the repeated calls to abandon the location, because he was more concerned with good press than commanding, at least until October 3rd, 2009. Taliban forces besieged the outpost in massive numbers. Though the meager and outgunned Americans were able to fend off the attack, killing around 150 insurgents in the process, it still took 8 American lives, with 27 wounded. A QRF managed to fly to OP Fritsch and march to COP Keating to relieve them and end the battle. A couple days later, COP Keating was abandoned and blown to smithereens. Soon Cop Lowell was too, virtually abandoning Nuristan province for a year and a half. Okay. So I arrived in Kunar province in early July of 2009. Our mission was to protect the PRT. While we weren't doing Sec 4 missions, we were protecting the FOB. We had an OP that was constantly manned, and an ECP that operated certain hours. Given we were in Kunar, with places like the Korangal and Hill 1311 within range of the artillery on our FOB, my barracks walls, which were originally built by the Russians, by the way, would rattle from the constant firing of the big guns. Plus, Taliban mortar attacks were just a weekly occurrence, to the point that I once freaked out a friend that I was emailing while we were under fire by making light of the whole situation. We were constantly getting into tics, even a few on the FOB itself. That was in contact. Heck, since we got hit so often, my battalion would send people to be around us for a few days just to earn their combat action badges. Suffice it to say, much of my experience mirrors what is depicted in this movie, though we never had to fight that many insurgents at once, and my platoon came back relatively unscathed. I remember when they started making movies about this area, specifically Restrepo and Korangal, but those were documentaries, and I don't review those. Plus, they still took place before I arrived. In fact, the Korangal Valley itself was closed while I was there, which is mentioned in both films. I have reviewed other Afghan war movies, but they take place years before I came into theater, and the war changed drastically throughout 2009. This movie, on the other hand, is different. First, my platoon often functioned as QRF throughout the province, though never that far north. If Hollywood made a movie about the Battle of Ganjagal, that is something we were supposed to be QRF for, but we were waved off by the commanders in the field. That's kind of a whole screwed up situation, and the local command botched the whole thing, and people are rightly angry about that whole thing. And we were right there ready to assist, and waved off. I fought during the Afghan elections and even visited Fob Bostik a couple of times because of PRT missions, though we flew up there rather than taking Route California the whole way up. If we passed Hill 1311, we were pretty much guaranteed to get in a fight. Funny enough, I've got some combat footage from one of the guys up at Fob Bostik, cause why not exchange that kind of stuff when you're just sitting around at Bagram, the kind of hub in the country, and just waiting around. Too bad I can't show that stuff on YouTube, since it is kind of gory. Perhaps more importantly though, and this is actually a good point to be jumping ahead if you get a bit squeamish about these things, because I was trained as honor guard back home, and that often meant I ended up guarding the fallen. Yeah, this is gonna get a bit dark, so you've been forewarned. If you want to skip, there's the timestamp. We had a large enough freezer on our fob to store their bodies. You can't just immediately fly them home, and to honor the fallen, someone needs to be by their side, even when in a freezer. Though not inside the freezer, I'd end up sitting outside of it, for normally just a few hours, just to make sure that the body temperature stays low enough that it doesn't start decomposing on flight. I did train some of my platoon on how to respect a body properly, so they might have dealt with these bodies themselves, and I might have been off on mission. I don't know anything in terms of which thing was which. But when the time came to move them, I'd often be part of the detail taking them to the helicopter because I was sitting right there. And yes, this probably includes some of the actual people who died at the Battle of Kamdesh, which this movie is based on. So I'm not directly involved in this story, but yeah, still have some involvement. This is the kind of bias you have to explain thoroughly because I have no way of accounting for how it affects my storytelling. People complain of my political bias or whatnot. Most of those complaints don't really matter, but let's not get into that stupidity. Hopefully you see why this is the kind of bias that matters. Keep it in mind because I'm not even pretending to try to separate myself from this one. Despite being there myself, I was just some lowly gunner for the PRT. I wasn't privy to the larger story. That's the problem with taking memoirs or the guys on the ground word for it. If you don't bother to do any kind of extra research, you get phenomenal flops like the 13 Hours movie made by Michael Bay, which was utter trash. I mean, I didn't know what the Battle of Ganjagal was until I was watching The Daily Show and Dakota Meyer started telling his side of the story, and I went, hey, wait a second, that sounds awfully familiar. Good interpretation of primary sources requires critique, and if I just went off of my experience, this review wouldn't be possible. Luckily, this movie was based on a work of journalism, not a memoir. Jake Tapper is a journalist and spends a lot of time bemoaning the command structure, from Bush and Obama down to colonels in the field. Don't get me wrong, it was really that bad, but journalists always seem to find ways of sensationalizing everything. The movie also had many of these veterans on site, some of whom even play themselves. I love it when movies do that. So those guys could give the more personal side of things. I went deeper still, consulting declassified reports and having done some prior reading on the history of the war for another project. What was interesting was marrying all of that with my personal experience. That really gives you a new perspective. Like, I thought I wasn't part of the surge because the larger part came in 2010 halfway through my deployment. The fob I was on was pretty tiny, yet it suddenly had to support a lot more people. Though I wasn't technically part of the surge since we were replacing the previous PRT Kunar, which that mission began in 2006. But I did arrive during the surge. Either way, I think researching this has made me grow as a historian, simply by being able to see how we historicize things I actually did. But how well did the movie do? Pretty well, actually. I'd venture to say I'm quite happy with this movie. Given how few are coming out in 2020, this might be the best of the year. They not only nail the looks of everything, but the general feeling. From the get-go, they show us how poorly the COP was placed, and why it was a recipe for disaster.
Look at this place.
Yeah, the Taliban have a nice fucking view of us, don't they?
We get a real good understanding of the dynamic at play there, how minor issues with villagers could become explosive, the way discipline and camaraderie worked in such conditions, the ineptitude of commanders, and how the doldrums of regular soldiering can instantly turn to craziness. For as a World War I soldier said, "War is months of boredom punctuated by moments of terror." And that holds very true today. The first movie I remember getting this right was Jarhead, but that one has some laughably unrepresentative parts. This doesn't. In terms of astonishingly good takes, this film handles PTSD better than I've ever seen. This shows an honest depiction of the disorder that Hollywood had better learn from. It's not something that just happens. It's not something everyone gets. Those who do go through their own inner turmoil, and it's almost never some kind of psychosis. This movie shows that people who do get PTSD are not fundamentally broken or just some consequence of seeing the horrors of war. Instead, it is them having trouble working through what they've experienced, and they need help. Finally, I'm just happy to see them not trying to dumb all the jargon down, even if it might be confusing to some folks. That's why I didn't for this review. It's much more authentic. These are a bunch of Cav scouts, and having been one myself, the whole way they interact with one another is just spot on. Like, the movie even goes out of its way to make fun of the way other movies depict camaraderie.
For the brotherhood, man, look at us. Band of brothers.
Knock it off. I got my blessing to kick his whiskey tango ass when we get back.
Or even how outsiders tend to act aghast at the frat boy kind of atmosphere.
All this frat boy shit and the joking around. Got their fucking dicks in their hands.
It's because you're always the odd man out. You're always on the fucking sidelines. Even if it is frat boy shit.
Well, what do you expect when you get a bunch of young dudes in such circumstances? This is as honest about interpersonal drama in the military as it gets. Also, the fighting is, of course, pretty spot on. That's not really that difficult to do, except I love that they didn't try to make some big culminating moment. Battles often simply don't have that, and it takes a hell of a good storyteller to not resort to embellishing it and somehow get more dramatic value out of a fight fizzling out. But of course, there are some things to be forewarned of. There's a lot of time compression in this, and if you know the story, it might be a bit confusing. Like, they show the deaths of Keating and Yeskes as though they were just before the Battle of Kamdesh, when Keating died in 06 and Yeskes in 08. There's also an inaccuracy in both these deaths that I'm glad they made. Keating actually lived to be transported after his crash, where the 5-ton literally rolled over him. Also, there was a passenger who survived relatively unharmed. Yeskes was even more gory than depicted. He was struck by an IED, like is shown, but most of him landed on the helipad down the hill, making a puddle of human gore. The private who got PTSD had a lot to deal with after having picked up the pieces. Suffice it to say, we don't want to see that. The one inaccuracy that bugged me is in the beginning info cards. They call it PRT Kamdesh. No such thing existed. A PRT is a type of unit, and the P stands for province, as in Nuristan. What they meant to call it is COP Keating, as in Combat Outpost, the namesake of the movie. That's a badly blatant blunder, but it doesn't bungle the big picture. Just pretend they called it COP instead of PRT, and you'll be fine. There, I fixed your movie. All in all, it's a really amazing film. Definitely better than the other 2 Afghan war movies I've reviewed. Though, at some point, I really need to review The Beast of War. I literally showed that movie to some Pashtuns in theater, and they actually loved it. I wonder how they'd like this. Anyways, check out The Outpost if you haven't. This movie is well worth your time. By the way, stick through the credits, because they show a bunch of interviews of the veterans on set. Let's hope that there will be more movies like this in the future. I don't know if you can hear it, but King wants into the room. He's not getting in the room, though. Perhaps more importantly, and this might be the place that you want to, Oh, okay. Shouldn't be drinking and then immediately saying stuff. What? And before you go, don't forget to check out the Great Courses Plus for a free trial by either clicking the link in the description or going to thegreatcoursesplus.com/thecynicalhistorian. Catch y'all in the next one.